Happy New Year to everybody. Glad you could join us tonight. And like Pádraig said, we were meant to have this before Christmas, but the storm knocked us out of power back then. So it's great that you're here with us now. And again, I suppose these Wednesday webinars are kind of a replacement, a poor replacement in some sense for our tea talks that we've been having over in Tubber Hall the last number of years. So hopefully now that the pandemic, well, hopefully it's going to leave us alone for a while so we can get back to those face-to-face events in future, so we can complement them at webinars with the face-to-face events. But listen, it's great to be here, and particularly with Declan, who's a real hero of mine. He's when we talk about the barn and all the treasures of the barn, Declan is absolutely one of them, and I've been privileged to hear him perform in Kinvara many times with great people, including the late John Bryan, of course. So it's a pleasure to be joined by him here tonight. And I know he's a great lover of this place, and we're going to chat about that in a moment as well. What Pádraig and I decided we might like to start with, though, is maybe a little bit of, just to connect this talk to the burn, a little bit just about the famine, the legacy of the famine in the burn. So I just had maybe 3 slides to show you here. And I'll just begin with these, and then we'll go across to Declan to talk about the wonderful book. So can you see that?
Yeah.
So I just doing a little bit of kind of research back into the burn and how the famine affected the burn. So here's just an interesting reference to sort of the impact in terms of the population. So in the barony of the burn, about 70% of the houses in 1841, just before the famine, were categorised as 4th class, compared with 37% nationally and 51% in County Clare. So there's obviously a very high proportion here. And I love the description here. These 4th class houses were once roomed mud or stone shacks with only one single square hole in the front, which serves at once for window, chimney, house door and stable door, since light, smoke, pigs, men pigs all pass in and out through this hole. It was these dwellings and their occupants that bore the brunt of the famine, while all other dwelling types increased between 1841 and 1851. The number of these 4th class dwellings was decimated, falling by 77% in County Clare alone. That's over the course of 10 years. So those populations were really quite marginalised, really suffered the most during the famine times. And it's amazing when you walk across the burn in the most odd locations, you'll come across single stone houses. Now, often these were herdsmen's houses, which is a different story. In fact, Michael Cusack, who was born near me here in Cairn tonight, he was born in I think it was around 1845 in a herdsman's house. But in the burn, in some very remote locations, you'll come across clachans or these clustered settlements, which have been studied by people like Maggie Ronayne up in NUI Galway. They're scattered all across the burn, but those would have been full of life and full of people during famine times, and they're quite a sad reflection of the decimation in the population around that time. Particularly, I think in coastal areas, it said that there was a huge loss of population.
Brendan, sorry to interrupt you. It's not full screen, so are you able to change the display?
Well, I've only got 4 slides, so I'll just stick with this.
No. Okay, there's
apologies for that.
No
I could try, but I'll fail, I'm sure. There's a fascinating structure in the burn as well, and it's called what we call it locally is the turf tile. And I'll just show you a couple of these. You'll be familiar with them, those of you who know the burn. And a lot of people wonder what they were for, and as best as we can establish is they're used for procuring fuel during times of fuel poverty. And there's an interesting reference as well from Her Majesty's Commission for Inquiring into the Condition of the Poorer Classes in Ireland, which talks about the fact that the private distillation of illegal spirits is almost unknown from the total absence of fuel. And in 1852, the people in the burn were literally cooking their fuel with dried fern, heath, brambles, and the branches of hazel, of which there was scanty growth here and there amongst the stone walls which divide field from field. And we have a lot of reference to the fact that not only was there a food famine in the burn in the mid-19th century, but there was also a fuel famine. Everything that could possibly be harvested for fuel, for cooking your food and keeping warm, was harvested and exploited to its maximum extent. And these structures, these turf tiles, these were actually a reflection of that, because cow dungs were actually gathered and packed between these walls, as were sods of heath, basically sods of earth, were taken from the surrounding ground, put in between these walls. It was thatched on top, and then the wind would blow through those walls to dry out those cowpats and pieces of heath, and they were the source of fuel at that time. So they're almost a kind of a reflection of the hardship of the landscape and the fact that there was a fuel famine here around that time. Just thirdly, I wanted to talk about these, which are probably most closely associated with the famine in the Burren, and these are called the Bordering na Gorta, or the famine roads. Now, these are different from what we call the green roads, which were old drove routes. But these famine roads, again, they're fragments of these highways running across the Burren. They're probably most notable by virtue of the fact that they really begin nowhere and end nowhere. They're fragments of road scattered in the landscape. But as feats of engineering, they're just extraordinary. There's one here in Gorta Clare in the top left. And that wall, the side wall there is about maybe over 4 meters high, and it skirts around the contour of the hill. It's extraordinary. The main one on the right there, that image is from the Burren National Park. And you see how finely finished it is. And left and right of the road are little heaps of chip. And apparently it's said that the women and the children, their role was to break the pieces of rock into small chip to surface the roads during the famine time. And that's how they stayed alive, the subsistence that they got from that. And there's another beautiful one on the left. It's totally lost in the landscape, that one on the left. And I came across it one day, and it's just so beautifully built, but so sad in the fact that it was just left behind as well. So that's also part of the famine history of the Burren. And of course, a lot of you will be familiar with the beautiful sculpture on the road between Ennistimon and Lahinch, and it relates to the story of the workhouse as well. So it's a very beautifully evocative structure that you can see there. But that's kind of a little bit about the Burren and the famine. But really, what we wanted to explore tonight is Declan's wonderful new book, The Pawnbroker's Reward, which is, I guess, an insight into that sad time in Ireland. So we're delighted to have Declan join us tonight. And maybe we can start, and also we'll be glad of your questions as we go along. But maybe if we start, Declan, maybe tell us a little bit about your connection with the Burren and what brought you here and what's kept you here these past number of years.
Sure, Brendan. Happy New Year. I won't be left out and saying that to everybody. And great to be here. Delighted to be invited on board and to be, doing something with you guys who are local. And I'm a real admirer of your work, learning more about it as we go. My connection with this place and this part of the world is that my granddad came from here, and before him, obviously, there were some generations of my family from here on my mother's side, the paternal side, and he was a painter. He lived in Kinvara until he was about 20, and moved away to England after that. Ended up in Dublin, where he started a family, which included my mother as one of his daughters. But he painted Kinvara all his life, and scenes of this beautiful place that I was just drawn to. They were scattered, across every household in our family as a kid. We all had them in quite a large family, and we all had these dreamy images on our walls of this mysterious place in the West. And I always wanted to. I visited here when I was 5, I think, maybe 4. It was 1980, the year he died, and that was I wasn't here again until I was 24, 25. But that, there was a great romance had built, a romantic attachment had grown up in my mind about the place in between those years. And eventually, when I did get to see it, I instantly fell in love with it, and it was quite an emotional experience arriving here as a young man. Actually, I had a very strong sensation that I was coming home, and it was you know, it was really affected me. I was very, you know, I was traveling in a car with 3 Australian friends of mine who I had given a very light introduction to my history with the place. And you know, as we drove over the hill into Kinvara, and Dungura appeared, and just the town, and I guess I started to just, my face was in floods of tears, and they were all wondering what was wrong with me, you know. But that was it was a very moving experience, and I knew I wanted to spend some time here, but that kind of led to me eventually living here and reconnecting, I suppose.
And what became of your grandfather's home place here in Kinvara then, Declan? Is that still around, or is that a ruin?
The building that he grew up in is no longer there, but it would have been on the site, and perhaps just a tiny bit behind the cottage where Sean Ford's family grew up, if you know that one, which is near Patricia Martin, and just about 100 meters up the road from the castle there.
Okay. And Declan, when you were schooled, reared and schooled in Dublin, and had you a particular interest in history at that time? Just leading us on to current talk, but had you also a fascination with history in times past, or was that a more recent interest?
More recent. I was always interested in history, but not necessarily in school. Actually, I don't. Maybe I was just a bit wayward in my teens at the time when there was actual classes going on. I was more interested in music, but it certainly was something that snuck up on me after school, and you know, through writing songs and exploring various subjects, I started to get pulled into it more in a more accidental way, or less traditional way, I suppose.
Because a lot of people, I think, tonight would be aware of the album that you had, Chronicles of the Great Irish Famine, which is just this beautiful, haunting album that you had, and that kind of preceded the book, and even some of the characters from that album appeared centrally in the book. So where did you come by that connection with history and with the famine in particular, Declan, originally?
Well, again, that comes back to my granddad, actually, and it turned out we learned around 1999 or probably 2000 from his birth cert that he had been born in the workhouse in Gort in 1916. Oh. And I think that had a profound effect on him for probably other reasons that were more to do with church and state and things like that, you know. But really, it was a door opening for me, because my family and I were all very intrigued hearing that, but nobody really knew what a workhouse was. We were all familiar with the word somehow, but wanted to find out more. And within a short few months, I stumbled upon a book in Dublin in Eason's one day. It was called The Workhouses of Ireland, and I almost couldn't believe my luck that this thing just appeared in front of me all of a sudden. And I picked up a copy and sat on the bus on the way home that evening, leaving town, and literally the first page in the introduction told me the story of the Buachalla family from Macroom and their experience of the workhouse, which, you know, I guess by the time I'd opened the cover and read the cover, I knew that the workhouse was a product of the famine and those times. So it was that was my introduction to the subject. But that story and the very brief account of it that I got on that first page was so moving for me, and it just was something that I was instantly fascinated by, and wondered how we didn't all know that story as a nation for a start, but that I thought it was such a powerful story and so universal that there couldn't be anyone anywhere who would read that and not be moved. And it took me a long time to, I've never recovered from reading it, but it took me a long time to unravel the emotions that I felt when I read that. And I realized over time that it wasn't just tragic, but that there was beauty in it too, and something almost to aspire to in terms of how people look after each other and the resilience of people in terrible times and what the human spirit is capable of. And basically, just to give anyone a sense who doesn't know the story or is not sure what I'm referring to, the few lines I read were of a man who carried his wife home from the workhouse. He said, mile after weary mile to their old home, and was found the next morning dead, with his wife's feet held to his chest as if he'd been trying to warm them. And it was just very overwhelming, really. I thought it was so powerful. I thought it was something that needed to be shared, you know. And so my instinct as a young songwriter then was to share that in song. And you know, as a young writer too, you know, you're constantly looking for things to write about, and anything that moves you is generally potential material. But this was far outside the realms of anything I had done at that point, you know, because it was something that was very real and delved into my own history, and it was my own identity and culture and my own people, I suppose. And so I went at it with real intent and a sense of not only emotional kind of impetus, but almost excitement as well at having something so powerful to work on and to share, and something of a subject that I felt had been neglected. And I hadn't really learned about it in school. It somehow, you know, my memory of hearing about that in school was literally a passing comment or two. You know, we might have read a page on it in school, but I felt that it really was an underexposed thing, and for whatever reasons, that didn't concern me. But I thought this story was a great way to share it, and I began to read more of that book, intent on, you know, learning more about the subject for a start. But from the very first page, I wanted to find out more about these people. I'd already started the song just based on those few lines alone. And by the time I reached the section of the book that actually spoke about them, it was just a couple of pages, and it was quite near the back of the book. But by the time I got there, I had underlined quite a few other passages, maybe a dozen or so, that I just thought were potential songs on their own. And it was such a vast subject, and it was so dense, and there was so much material, so many different angles, perspectives, and you know, ways to present it, that I thought one song wouldn't do it justice. And I kind of set myself a goal to work on it in the background, and you know, out of a kind of fear that if I did it wrong or didn't turn over every stone, that I could probably not only do it an injustice, but perhaps be torn to shreds by academics and critics, you know. So I quietly just read book after book over the years, and I kind of seemed to knock out maybe a song a year on average over 15 years reading about it. And in 2017, I eventually recorded a collection of songs based on, as you say, personal accounts. And there were 13 songs on that, I think.
Including that wonderful Poor Boy Shoes, I think that you referenced earlier. It's interesting, Declan, in the sense, in terms of how we teach history, it tends to be, I know my own son is in secondary school now, it tends to be a lot about dates and events and numbers and stats. But it's interesting that your sort of connection with it and how you developed an empathy with the whole tragedy of the famine was through one single story. The story of it's almost by personalizing it and individualizing it, it's a more powerful way to make that connection and to create the opening that gave you the hunger to learn more about it. I'm just curious, how did people respond to the album? So here's a young up and coming, musician who's, already quite well known, quite popular, but this is a real turn into the dark side, in a sense, the famine album. How did people respond?
Well, to start, when I started to sing the songs, I hadn't a clue what to expect of people. I guess I thought that based on the style of music, which became the vehicle for the songs, and were my earliest inspirations in music, I suppose, the likes of Planksy and Christy Moore and Paul Brady and Andy Irvine, music like that growing up, which was quite traditional, but of probably the highest discipline I feel in terms of the instrumentation or musicality of traditional Irish music. I say that with great respect to many other musicians and that, but they were the pinnacle for me, and certainly in the realm of song. And so I felt that would at least help the subject matter to be accessible and accepted by people. But I really wasn't sure if there would be a kind of a repulsive reaction to it, but I found from very early on, because we'd say the first, even though I started Poor Boy's Shoes as the first song, it wasn't the first one I finished. Some of them took years. But from the very first one that I began to perform live, and it was out on its own, we might say, in my other collection of songs, as something kind of different, there was a really serious reaction to it. You could feel it in the room whenever I played them, and there was like a guttural response that seemed to me, from what people said, that it almost brought something out of them that they didn't know was in there. And that was very interesting, and it was really encouraging to hear those things, and it kind of added to my impetus. There were some funny experiences too. There was I remember one small place I played in Kilkenny one time, and around 2004, so it was early in this project, and I played a song, and I must have told some introduction, but halfway through the introduction, when I said something about the famine, there was somebody in the crowd who just shouted at the top of their voice with a fist pump, "Up the famine!" And it brought the whole room into kind of an uproar of laughter. And that person, whoever it was, they showed up at a few gigs after that, or it caught on, and it became a bit of a thing. So there was, sometimes there's a levity to things with great seriousness and emotion too.
Interesting. Well, I think it's like the beauty of the music carried it so well, but I think that it was an amazing way of getting a message out, or a reminder out in a very different way. Because normally that kind of deep message about our national history isn't communicated through the medium of contemporary song. So I think it was kind of surprising to a lot of people, but I think it really struck a chord with so many people who might otherwise not have. With the book itself, I'm curious, Declan, as to why you choose a pawnbroker as the kind of the nexus of the book, this Cornelius Creed, rather than, you know, it seems like an almost strange choice, but he was at the epicenter of the community and everything that happened around that. And is that why you chose him? And could you tell us a bit more about this character?
Absolutely. Just to get back to something that I meant to say on the last, on your last point before we go further, before I talk about the pawnbroker, I think you're right, and I think I was very, very lucky to have stumbled across this book, the Workhouses of Ireland, as my introduction to the subject, and even so quickly on page 1, you know, because with the greatest of respect to the historians and academics who have presented amazing material and information over the years that is so fundamental to our understanding of the subject, it is hard sometimes when you're reading that stuff to connect with the reality of what it meant to people. I had the experience when my wife and I visited Auschwitz, you know, maybe I think it was 10 or 12 years ago. And while we were there and we were presented with, you know, it's arguable that it could be for numerous reasons that it was kind of overwhelming, but we couldn't while we were there, it didn't make sense to us that this place was the place where these things happened. It was a clean place with no people in it. It just didn't make sense to the brain. But I think part of the problem was that the information they gave us on a lot of the tour were very large numbers and statistics. You know, even the rooms full of shoes and glasses, and it was kind of overwhelming to try and process that much information and that much suffering. But when you looked at one single picture of a face and you just read about that one person, then it made sense, you know, and then you could relate to it. And similarly with reading that account of the Buachalla family, I felt that it stripped away everything else and connected you with it in a way through your own empathy, because what you tend to do as a human being when you read something like that is you imagine your own parents and your own children, and that's how you experience it. Then it kind of, it's only when you imagine yourself in the situation or somebody that you love that it really hits you and you have an emotional understanding of it. And I think in that sense, one tiny drop or one distillation of something in a way can explain the whole thing, whereas the whole thing sometimes doesn't tell you much, you know. So I was lucky enough to have experienced it in that way myself, and I suppose almost accidentally that became my method of then presenting it to other people. So but thanks for observing that. Now in answer to the question about Cornelius Creed, he, as I began to write about the Buachalla family for the book, and I wanted to find out as much as I could about their lives and where they lived, who was around them, what was available to them in terms of options for sources of food and survival and work and anything at all. And you know, as with very similarly to as you described there with that with that very evocative picture, and the point about the clock-ons, and how 70% of these tiny little houses just disappeared, and the people who lived in those fourth-class houses the country over were largely either Irish speakers, or they were classed as illiterate. They didn't read or write, and didn't leave any kind. Most of the way the famine was recorded for us was by the clergy, or by administrative people in local government and foreign government. So those voices were largely lost, and their experiences are mostly gone, apart from what survived, which is very little, precious little, really, very sadly. And in many cases, those ruins and those almost scars on the landscape are all that remain of them, and to show that they were there. Otherwise, we'd have practically no sense at all, apart from a figure, So it was very hard to find much information at first, and as I explored the area more and more, I started to, and I was, a lot of this was done during lockdown, so from the comfort of this room, generally, I didn't have the opportunity to go and explore archives and libraries in person during this time. But then, the gift of modern technology for this era, I actually believe that if I tried to write this book 20 or 30 years ago, there's no way I could have accessed the information I could have, even with libraries and everything else, because they don't have search engines on microfilm and things like that, so you can do it all from the comfort of your home now, really, which gave me access to so much information that I'm sure many academics even and historians haven't had access to in the same way before. But one of the sources that became hugely important for me was simply newspapers of the time. And Cornelius Creed was a pawnbroker in the center of town, who at first was just one of quite a few people who kind of appeared with just a little piece of information in the paper here or there. And at first you're just making little notes, and you're kind of going, okay, that pawnbroker says this, and I must find out more about that, or try and back that information up, or whatever. But as it went on, I kept coming across this guy more and more, and he started to become very colorful, and I started to realize how important he was, certainly to me as a source, first of all, but then as somebody who was literally at the eye of the storm. This guy was the pawnbroker, which meant he was one of two pawnbrokers in the town. And that meant the poor were literally crossing his doorstep every day. And so he was in direct connection with them. And in many cases, you read that the pawnbrokers was the last stop they made on the way to the workhouse to sell their last earthly goods and things like this, or that they kept themselves afloat a lot of the time by pawning whatever one or two, potentially valuable items they had, just for a few days at a time, or short periods of time, to get them through short periods, and then they'd pawn them back. And so he was in contact with them a lot that way. But then he was also a volunteer on the local relief committee, and as well as that, he was, very importantly, he was a correspondent for the newspaper, one of 3 newspapers in Cork, the Cork Examiner, which is a paper that is still in circulation today. It's the Examiner now. But he was a correspondent, and his job really, and I saw it earlier on in his writings more, he was acting as a kind of a correspondent to report on what was happening at the Board of Guardians meetings within the workhouse. So the Board of Guardians were literally the local landlords and the wealthy who were given the job of running the workhouse and taxing themselves to run it. So, you know, it was in their interest to keep those taxes low and those expenses down. And you see a lot of messy kind of things, interactions going on between the lines when you study what they were doing. And so he is a very vocal correspondent and is literally putting us in the room at both ends of the scale there. And on top of that, he started to write opinion pieces, which is something that I never came across in all the years I read about the subject. You had this person who was actually venting to the paper, and even though he was a pawnbroker, which seems like a really questionable job in these times, he was a real advocate for the poor. So he had this very conflicted relationship with them, and which begins to color a lot of his writing. And he's a really beautiful writer, real intellectual, and he had his own kind of tragedies and very interesting things happening around him that are filtering into his writing. So, you know, I eventually reached a point where I thought he was so important, and he became central without me even setting out looking for somebody else. And you know, it turned into a very, very fortunate find, and I became almost as emotionally attached to him as I did to the Buachalla family, you know. And it became a kind of a story with 2 large branches from the same root, I thought, you know, because he was literally connecting all the layers of society, including theirs. And so that's his part in the story.
It's a fascinating choice of a central character, but I can completely see why he would be given the position that he occupied between the guardians and the poor on his doorstep all the time. You do kind of refer at some stage, I think, that the role of wider political forces and local government decisions on kind of shaping the fate of all those involved. And maybe this relates to Cornelius's rantings, Declan. Would you elaborate on that a little bit on the bigger picture and how that enters your narrative?
Yeah, so again, going with the realization that you pointed out earlier on, that, you know, a distillation or one person's story can be so illustrative and powerful in its own way that much more information can't. And also equipped with the knowledge and the years of experience trying to understand the subject in its vastness on my own, reading so much about it, I realized that maybe if I could tell the story through this one little town and in kind of a chronological fashion, so that we can experience it as they saw it unfolding, that would, and you know, you only really get the larger picture as it filtered into them. I thought if I could do it that way, I would probably stand a better chance of giving people an understanding of it. And again, I was so lucky because Creed was enabling me to do that, because he was connecting all these layers of society. And again, to talk about why his own position was so conflicted he was a Catholic, but he was a middle-class Catholic, of which there was a layer of this society, you know, and we often, looking back on history and from the perspective of the present, when it's so far back and it has become almost just polarized in folk memory, boiled down to two elements, if you like, the rich and the poor. You don't think that there was a middle-class Irish kind of layer of society, you know? And so it was very interesting to discover that. And, you know, as I was getting to know him and the people around him who were his colleagues and his friends who were also Catholic and landowners, and some of them were on the board of guardians even. So they had very responsible positions. It was an education in itself, because I was trying to figure out what was their stance and what was their position and what was their colors, if you like, you know. And as confusing as that was, I thought it was important to present it intact, so that I wasn't guilty of also trying to boil things down and just do what has always been done. So I thought if I just present it as complicated as it is, it also helps people to see how strange and complex this time was, and, you know, partially why it happened. So you've got these meetings, they're weekly meetings with the Board of Guardians. Of course, I didn't give every single weekly meeting, but we kind of dramatized quite a few of them. And you see these conflicts going on, and the different things where you've got, you know, one guy might be the secretary of the relief committee, but he's also a part-time agent for landlords, and he's a part-time money lender to the poor. And then on top of all that, he is the biggest corn merchant in the town, and he is the sole outlet for this Indian meal, which is, you know, the prices of it are fluctuating in a really strange way because the demand for it has increased. And then you've got these same people who he is sitting on the board with, it's their job to kind of lobby the government to bring in some of this Indian meal and give it to the poor at cheaper prices. But of course, it's more likely in his interest that it doesn't get given out so freely, because then his prices drop. And so you know, you're kind of watching them through the minutes, if you like, or the descriptions of the meetings that Creed is presenting, and reading between the lines of this complex kind of cloak and dagger language they're using to present their own positions, you know. And then at times they're doing things like interviewing actual applicants, people who are coming in seeking admission to the workhouse, and they have to convince them of their poverty, because, you know, the laws at the time are saying that you can't enter the workhouse unless you're classed as absolutely destitute, and you can't be destitute if you have any land, or any land that's over a quarter of an acre or something like this. And so essentially you have to give over your land and sign it away if you want to get in, which is a one-way street, really. And so you know, it's damning, and it's fascinating, and it's more complex than you expect. as you're looking at all their perspectives, you know. But behind all of that, the hope is that you're constantly attending to and presenting the human story of the Buachalla and what it's really like for the people on the ground. So it's trying to see it from both ends and understand the relationships, you know.
And as you sort of immersed yourself in the topic, and clearly you're still in there, Declan, which is great, and it speaks well to the book. Did you have to struggle to resist the temptation to simplify and to finger point and to sort of to control your own, I guess, personal outrage at some of the things that you read? Were you able to stay fairly neutral and observant and presented in that way? Was that a challenge?
It wasn't really a challenge, and I'll tell you why. Somebody said to me early on that somebody gave me as a piece of advice, knowing that I was beginning the book. It could have been any book, I suppose, but they knew it was a book on this subject of history, and they just simply said to me, "The truth fears no interrogation." And I thought that was really a good maxim, I suppose, to start with. And I wrote it down and kept it nearby as I worked, among other things. But as I got further into it and was discovering all of these things, and you know, these people, which really was, I have to say, in hindsight, I kind of forget sometimes, because I know so much about it now, and I've been so immersed in it for a period of time. I actually started the book, we'd say, 3.5 years ago, even though the main thrust of it happened in the last 1.5 years, or 2 years, I should say. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by timelines, but and I've completely lost my train of thought on that question now.
Yeah, it's more sort of the immersion that clearly you experienced in writing the book. How did it lead to any sort of sense of rage or bias, and was it difficult to control that?
I remember now, the point I wanted to make was that as I got to know them more, and I realized that there was a second part to that piece of advice that man had given me, really, or potentially was, and it was that the truth didn't need any exaggeration in this instance. And you know, you almost couldn't exaggerate it. It was so bad and bad enough that it didn't need any kind of beefing up in any way. And you know, that helped me to I didn't need any extra rage or anything, you know. And perhaps, you know, from being as familiar with the subject as I was over time, not a lot surprised me in that sense. So I wasn't as enraged by things, possibly through desensitization over time, but possibly as disgusted as I ever was at the same time, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does indeed. Just we're kind of coming close to time, but just a couple of other questions, Declan. I suppose the wonderful thing about the book and the album that preceded it, I know the two separate projects, but is that it kind of has really helped people to empathize with the people themselves who are so heavily impacted during the famine times. But it sometimes surprised me that it actually wasn't that long ago. So the question is, do you think there's resonances of those famine times in terms of learnings that we shouldn't forget? In other words, by writing the book and the album, did you want to do something more than create a sense of empathy? Did you want to tell us something, teach us something, give us a lesson that we can learn from those times that we can apply today? Was that in your mind at all?
Absolutely, you know, and I thought the realization that I had about what, and again, when I go back to when I said it took me quite some time to unravel the emotions that I felt when I read that first account of the booklet. And part of that was the revelation about empathy and how we experience it and how we relate to the world in that sense, you know. And it was a personal discovery through tracing my own emotions that it was only when I imagined my own family in that situation that it became so impactful to me. And for that reason, I instantly realized that that's why it's important to keep these stories alive, because they teach us and they instruct us and they equip us with how to deal with things that are happening in the world around us, and hopefully give us that empathy that helps us to work to prevent things like this reoccurring. You know, there's the old adage that comes up over and over, that those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And that's always, you know, in the back of my head. And but you know, you are so right. It's not that long ago, and I realized that during it again, that even though I said my granddad was born in the workhouse, his grandfather, I've found on the Griffith's evaluation, was a Clean who was living down the Moy Road there, you know, very, very close to Slieve Carron in 1846.
Wow.
So he was born right around then, and right in the foothills of the Burren, I suppose, or right at the foot of it. And I think, you know, and I realized that, okay, my granddad was alive when I was born, and his granddad was alive when he was born, who was born in 1845 or 6. So it's actually only 3 lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
You say it's 6 or 7 generations, but it's actually 3 lifetimes, you know, which is incredibly close. And then Christine Kennelly, who was one of the leading scholars of the famine, I've had some really nice interactions with Christine, among other people in that community, and she talked to me about, introduced me to the idea of the science of epigenetics, which they reckon that inherited memory lasts 6 or 7 generations now. You know, I haven't got to look into it too much, but without even having to look at it too much, it seems to make a lot of sense, because you have these very, very deep feelings and associations about your past. And you know, I think anyway, I think the broader answer to your question is yes. I think it's very important to keep these stories alive.
That's fantastic. And before I hand back to Prentice, because we're running out of time, Declan, the time absolutely flew.
Fast, yeah.
Yeah, it went fast. But I'm delighted to hear that you've got such a strong ancestral connection with the Burren. That's news to me. That your grandfather's grandfather was roaming the foothills of Slieve Carron back in the day, which is fantastic. He probably came across Michael Cusick when he was up there as well back at that time. One thing I forgot to say at the start is we have this wonderful plant in the Burren. It's a grass. It's a small grass called quaking grass, but also known as Fair Gorta, or the famine grass. And people here always told me, since I've been lucky to be around, about the fact that it was called Fair Gorta because if you trod on this grass as you walked across the Burren, you could feel the pangs of hunger coming up from the ground, because apparently they used to say that it grows where people died during the famine. It sprouted up from their bones on the ground. And as you walked across the Burren, if you trod on the quaking grass or the famine grass or the Fair Gorta, that you felt the hunger coming up from the ground into your belly, and you got a weakness. And the only way to prevent it was to carry a hazelnut in your pocket. But there was always an old thing amongst the farming community that if you felt a bit worn out or a bit jaded when you're out herding the cattle, that was the fair Gorta. He stood in the fair Gorta and he needed a bit of nourishment. But the final thing I want to say is to commend people to buy the book. It's you know, Declan, just listening to tonight, you're such a thoughtful, engaging and interested person. It's not, obviously, this subject means a whole lot to you. And it's something that you've paid great attention and great care in crafting. And the book is a real tour de force. And for those like myself who have lots of book vouchers to use up, I know there's great deals at the moment. I really recommend that people go out there and buy it. It's fantastic. And I hope, Declan, that it's not the last. It's the first of your books, and I certainly hope it's not the last. So congratulations, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to hand back to Pranjali.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Declan. That was wonderful. And thanks, Brendan, for asking the questions. And really, the time flew. We thought we'd have loads of questions, loads of time to take questions. It doesn't appear to be so. But I just want to thank all our audience today. And they've texted in where they're tuning in from, Declan. We were wondering, some from North Carolina, from Brussels, from Bell Harbour, Dundrum in Dublin, Caircastle, Ballyvaughan, Knockbridge. So from all over the place, thank you so much for tuning in this evening. There's one, I mean, we were going to invite people to, if there's any last minute questions, any burning questions you have from Declan, put them into the Q&A box. There's just one there, Declan, from John Lamb. Declan, congrats on a really excellent book. Did you find writing a novel very different from songwriting?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for your questions and comments. I look forward to reading them after. The time really has flown. I hope it flew for you guys too. In answer to your question, John, it was both different and not at all in a way. I found it was different in terms of application because I had to put myself somewhere to do it. I had to sit down, and that was right where I sit right now. And I kind of, I tried to lock myself into this room for a few hours every day, and was largely successful in that. Sometimes I was, you know, the door was locked from the outside probably, but I at one point I didn't miss a day here in over 6 months, 7 days a week. I put myself in the room and immersed myself in this other world, time traveling. But that was the main difference. Other than that, it didn't feel that different to crafting a song or working on a song somehow. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Declan. I'm sure it does. Great answer. I just want to remind all the attendees today that this is part of our monthly webinars, our online talks that we conduct on the second Wednesday of every month, and it's part of a whole suite of programs and projects we work on throughout the year, and we rely on people's support and membership. So if anyone out there isn't a member yet or would like to gift a membership for this new year, a Burren Bureau Trust membership, please do visit burrenbureau.com. We really appreciate that, and check out all the stuff that we do. So this time,
No.
Say that again, Brendan.
I will be joining after.
Oh, thanks, Declan. Thanks. We welcome you. So the webinar next month, which is on 9th of February, will be by Elaine Lynch, who is an archaeologist, and she'll be talking to us about Temple Cronin and the story behind that monument and the recent restoration work that has happened there. So and we have a whole string of archaeological talks coming up. So watch the space. But it's 9 o'clock, so we'll better stick to the time. And thanks again for this evening, both Brendan and Declan. You're privileged to talk to.
Thank you, Pranjali. Thank you both.